It's the evening of January 2nd, 1956, in Great Falls, Montana. An 18-year-old Duane Bogle picks up his 16-year-old girlfriend, Patricia Kalitzke, from her family's house. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now before we continue, because this channel covers a new solved cold case every single week, and this is one of the oldest ever cracked using DNA. Duane is an airman stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base, originally from Waco, Texas. Patricia is a junior at Great Falls High School, described by classmates as bubbly, witty, and well-liked. The two met after Duane was stationed locally, and by this point they're planning to get married. Patricia's family says the couple spends nearly all their time together, and they've just finished celebrating Christmas with her family days earlier. That evening, the two leave the Kalitzke house headed for a local drive-in. Witnesses place them there together until just after 9 o'clock. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. Neither of them comes home that night. When Patricia doesn't return, her family initially assumes the young couple may have eloped, a detail that delays exactly how urgently the disappearance gets treated in those first crucial hours. The truth turns out to be far worse. On January 3rd, 3 boys hiking along the Sun River near Wadsworth Park, northwest of Great Falls, discover Duane's body near his car. Patricia's body is found separately, roughly 5 miles away. Both of them have been shot in the head. Investigators believe Duane was killed first, and that the person responsible then raped Patricia before killing her as well. The location where investigators believe the attack began is a spot locals refer to as Lover's Lane, an ordinary, familiar parking spot for young couples in the area, the kind of place that had never before been associated with anything like this. Springfield-style small-town shock doesn't begin to describe what this does to Great Falls. 2 well-liked teenagers, killed within hours of leaving a drive-in movie, their bodies found miles apart along the same river. Investigators pursue every lead available to them in 1956, and there are plenty of suspects to work through over the following years, including Edward Wayne Edwards, a man later linked to a string of Lover's Lane murders in Ohio and Wisconsin, and even briefly gangster James Whitey Bulger Jr. None of them can be forensically connected to the crime. What one preserved microscope slide, sitting quietly in an evidence room for decades, would eventually be capable of proving is the reason this case became the oldest cold case in the country ever solved using DNA and forensic genealogy. Stay with us. Because this happens in 1956, forensic science offers investigators almost nothing beyond witness statements and physical canvassing. But standard autopsy procedure at the time still calls for the collection of a vaginal swab from Patricia's body, prepared as a microscope slide and filed away with the rest of the case evidence, collected without any expectation it would ever be usable for identification, simply because it was protocol. Nobody in 1956 has any concept of DNA testing. The slide goes into storage, and the case, despite the department's best efforts, goes cold. Real quick, if this is the first case you've watched from us, let us know in the comments what state or country you're tuning in from. We read every comment, and it genuinely shapes which cases we bring you next. For decades, the file passes between generations of Cascade County detectives, each one inheriting a case that refuses to close. When retired Detective Phil Madison starts working in the evidence room back in 1988, the Kalitzke-Bogle homicide file is already sitting there, decades old at that point. In 2001, as a detective, Madison sends that same microscope slide, still intact after 45 years, to the Montana State Crime Lab for analysis. The lab makes a genuine breakthrough. They find a sperm cell on the slide that does not belong to Duane Bogle, confirming definitively that a second person was present and involved in the attack. That was just the process, and luckily it was retained in evidence all these years. Detective Sergeant John Cadner would later say, of that original 1956 collection. It's a real step forward, but it still doesn't produce a name. Over the following years, law enforcement compares the DNA sample against roughly 35 different suspects, ruling each one out in turn. When Madison eventually leaves the department, he tells colleagues he doesn't believe the case will ever be solved. A lot of different people had a turn at this, and we just weren't able to take it to conclusion, he says. In 2012, Detective John Cadner takes over the file on what is, for him, his very first cold case assignment. For years, he works it the same way his predecessors did, chasing whatever leads surface, running the DNA sample against new names as they come up, watching each comparison come back negative. The case remains exactly where it's been for over half a century. A preserved genetic profile with no name attached to it. Then, in 2018, an arrest 3,000 miles away changes what's possible for cases exactly like this one. California investigators announced the identification of Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. as the suspected Golden State Killer, using forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had, until that point, mostly been used to help adoptees locate biological family members, not to solve homicides. The method works by uploading an unknown crime scene DNA profile to genealogy databases and building out family trees from distant genetic matches until a single name emerges. In 2019, Cascade County detectives arranged for Bode Technology to perform additional testing on the DNA evidence recovered from Patricia's body, using techniques far more advanced than anything available even a few years earlier. The resulting profile gets uploaded to voluntary genealogical databases, the same kind of consumer genealogy sites ordinary people use to trace their own family history. Investigators find a possible family connection. Genealogists build out the family tree from that match, working the same painstaking process used in cold cases across the country, tracing distant relatives, cross-referencing against public records, narrowing an entire extended family down toward a single name. 3 people come back as genetically compatible matches. Among them is a man named Kenneth Gould. Going back through Gould's history, investigators find almost nothing that would have ever put him on a suspect list in 1956. He was 29 years old at the time of the murders, living a little over a mile from where Patricia Kalitzke lived. He worked corralling horses in the area, and was known to ride through the same general region where the killings took place. He had no criminal history before or after the murders. He was never interviewed during the original investigation. Investigators can find no documented connection between Gould and either victim. No shared friends, no known encounters, nothing that would have linked him to Patricia or Duane in any conventional sense. After the murders, Gould sells his property near the small town of Tracy. His family goes on to live in the Montana communities of Geraldine and Hamilton before relocating entirely to Missouri in 1967. They never returned to Montana. Gould dies in Oregon County, Missouri, on May 31, 2007, 14 years before investigators ever connect his name to Patricia and Duane's murders, and his body is cremated, meaning there's no direct biological sample investigators can pull from his remains, the way some cold cases eventually allow. Detective Cadner has to take a different, far more delicate route to confirm the match, reaching out to Gould's own children and asking them to voluntarily provide DNA samples. I wasn't sure how they were going to react when I come to them saying, "Hey, your dad's a suspect in this case." Cadner later says, "But they were great to work with." Gould's children agree, with no way of knowing in advance what the results might reveal about the father they grew up with, decades after his death, in a different state, with no history of violence any of them had ever witnessed or suspected. The DNA from Gould's children confirms the match. Investigators conclude that Kenneth Gould is more than likely responsible for the murders of Patricia Kalitzke and Duane Bogle. On a Tuesday in June 2021, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office formally announces that it has closed the file on the 65-year-old double homicide. Detective Sergeant John Cadner tells reporters it's the oldest case he can find anywhere in the country that's been solved using forensic genealogy. Investigators describe why the case had continued to matter so deeply to a department that had, by that point, spent more than 6 decades trying to close it. "You had 2 young, vibrant individuals that were well-liked among their peer group," Cadner says. "Investigators poured their heart and soul into this case. It's worth sitting with how narrow the margin actually was here. For over 65 years, the genetic evidence that would eventually identify Gould sat in storage, first as a simple, unremarkable microscope slide collected under standard 1956 autopsy procedure, then as a DNA sample, with nothing to compare it against beyond roughly 35 individually ruled out suspects. If that slide hadn't been carefully retained through decades of department moves, evidence room reorganizations, and simple institutional turnover, this case would have had nothing left to test by the time genetic genealogy became viable at all. If Detective Madison hadn't thought to send it out for renewed testing in 2001, or if forensic genetic genealogy hadn't matured into a usable investigative technique by 2018, spurred specifically by its success identifying the Golden State Killer, this case might still be sitting exactly where it sat for over 6 decades. A preserved genetic profile belonging to nobody, filed away in Cascade County alongside dozens of other unsolved homicides from the same era. There's something particularly haunting about how completely invisible Kenneth Gould remained for his entire life after the murders. He wasn't a documented predator with a criminal history investigators simply failed to connect. He had no prior record, no known connection to either victim, nothing that would have flagged him for a formal interview during the original 1956 investigation, even though he lived barely more than a mile from Patricia's own home. He simply sold his property, moved his family through 2 more Montana towns, and eventually relocated permanently to Missouri, living out the rest of his life more than 1,000 miles from Great Falls, dying in 2007, with no indication that anyone, anywhere, would ever connect him to a double murder from over half a century earlier. For the city of Great Falls, the deaths of Patricia Kalitzke and Duane Bogle occupied a singular, permanent place in local memory for generations. A case referenced by name across decades of Cascade County law enforcement, a file that multiple generations of detectives inherited and worked without ever getting close to an answer, right up until the final years when a technology nobody in 1956 could have imagined finally caught up to a single preserved slide. It's a resolution that offers no dramatic manhunt, no courtroom confrontation, no moment of the killer being cornered and forced to answer for what he did. Gould died 14 years before his name was ever connected to this case, having spent the entirety of the intervening decades living an unremarkable, undetected life in a different state, protected by nothing more than the limits of 1956 forensic science and the sheer scale of the country he'd relocated to. Patricia Kalitzke would be in her mid-80s now, had she lived. Duane Bogle would be in his late 80s. 2 teenagers planning a wedding, taken from a drive-in movie, and a familiar stretch of Lover's Lane, waited 65 years for their case to close, longer than either of them ever got to live. What their families and the city of Great Falls finally received wasn't a trial, wasn't a sentencing, wasn't the kind of courtroom resolution most families of murder victims eventually witness. It was simply a name, Kenneth Gould, attached at last to the oldest cold case in the country ever solved using DNA and forensic genealogy, delivered decades after the only person who could have answered for it had already died. We're tracking several other cold cases currently being worked through this same forensic genealogy process, and we'll bring you the next resolution the moment it's announced, but only to people already subscribed when it happens. Hit subscribe now, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and we'll see you in the next one.